overeducated, underskilled. Maybe it's the other way around, I forget. And I'm obsolete. I'm not economically viable.
Welcome to the podcast of postmodern madness and societal decay. Not economically viable. With your entropy coordinator and spirit guide Jay Swift.
In 2014, NBA Commissioner Adam Silver estimated that each year in America, more than $400 billion is illegally wagered on sporting events. However, the outcomes of an upcoming Supreme Court case could repeal PASPA, the Professional and Amateur Sports Protection Act of 1992, and potentially set the stage for legalized sports betting throughout the country. But if sports betting becomes legal coast to coast, what would the impacts be on sports leagues, casinos, and formerly illegal bookmakers? To dig a little deeper into the matter, we reached out to Brian Tuohy, author of the Fixes In Larceny Games and Season in the Abyss, to weigh in on the consequences, intended and unintended, of PASPA's potential overruling, and also the hypothetical potential pros and cons of legalized nationwide sports gambling. So let's get right to it, why don't we? Alright, welcome everyone to a new installment of Not Economically Viable, the podcast of postmodern madness and societal decline. Today we're going to talk about sports, more specifically the prospects of legalized sports gambling coast to coast in the United States, which very well could happen due to an upcoming Supreme Court case. So here to talk about the pros and cons of potential sports betting legalization, we have Brian Tuohy, who is one of the more prolific authors when it comes to the fairly niche subject of sports conspiracy theories. So I'm just going to throw it to Brian, let him introduce himself. Just tell us about your website, your books, and just your overall sort of oeuvre as a writer.
Well, I'm basically kind of an investigative sports reporter, of which there are few and far between these days. And out of that work, and like you said, it's a niche. I've kind of filled in a void that few people will step into. I've written 3 books based on sports, one called The Fixes In, another one called Larceny Games, and a third one called The Season in the Abyss. And then I run a website known as fixesin.net, and all my social media and contact information is available on that website for anybody who's interested.
And I know you're not exactly the biggest fan of this comparison point, but when people say you're sort of the ESPN version of Alex Jones, generally how do you feel?
It's not all bad. There is something to be said about being kind of alternative media, and I do look at myself kind of in that light because, I don't trust the likes of ESPN and Sports Illustrated the way I kind of used to, because the more I've learned about the sports media, and I've worked within the sports media. I mean, I used to write for Sports on Earth, which was co-owned by Major League Baseball Advanced Media and USA Today. I wrote for Vice Sports. I actually wrote an article for Sports Illustrated. And the more I've kind of been involved in those media outlets, those big sports media outlets, the more I realize, what they portray isn't exactly what goes on behind the scenes. And what goes on behind the scenes is a lot of the stuff that I write about and the subject matter I touch upon, they don't want to. And they don't want to make some of these things known. And they don't want to dig into some of these things, even though it's really not conspiracy. It's just not, portraying sports in the best of light.
And before we get into Christie versus NCAA and the upcoming Supreme Court case, it's probably worth our time to talk a little bit about what's going on with the NFL. Obviously, this season has been absolute anarchy from start to finish, with all the fluky finishes and the upsets every weekend. And really, the product itself seems to be taking a step away from the field and becoming more politicized each and every week. So just what are your general thoughts on the direction that pro sports is kind of heading as far as being sort of ideologically compromised entertainment?
Well, and you've hit upon 2 major subjects, is the fact that it is a entertainment. I mean, people look at professional sports as being sports, but really sports isn't an entity unto its own. It's actually part of show business. And even the NFL argued before the Supreme Court and stated they are show business, that they are part of the entertainment world. And like you said, what their product is, what they're selling to people, and this goes for the NFL, the NBA, all the major sports, is the games. And the games are in many ways a product, and that's what they want people to buy, and that's what they want people to consume. And so a lot of times I want fans to try to think about sports in that way. Think of it as a business, think of it as an entertainment business, and that the games are the product. And unfortunately, really, it's a product that they can manipulate and toy with as they feel because they own that product until, even while you consume it, they own that product. And it's just, the NFL has been really weird this year, like you said, and I think it's a lot to do with those national anthem protests. And I think it's thrown not only the league for a loop, but I think it's even thrown their broadcast partners for a loop because they're not 100% sure how to cover it. They want this to be entertainment. They want it to be escapism. And I think a lot of fans want it to be that way. But because this political nature of it has been thrust to the forefront, they can't avoid it. And it's really, I think it's affected their bottom line.
Yeah, I mean, there's no arguing against that. I mean, look at what's happening with NFL ratings. They're down anywhere from 10 to 20%, depending on which analyst you look at. So what do you think are the driving factors behind that? Is it just sort of a contempt of, the politicization of the product or something else going on?
Well, I think part of it is I think a lot of people are cutting, the cord in terms of cable watching. They're not viewing it as normal as they used to. So I think they're maybe if they are watching the NFL, they're watching it through a different means, which isn't covered through, like Nielsen ratings and that sort of thing. But I do think there are a lot of people that are upset about the anthem protests. I think there are people who are upset about the product in general. I don't think they like these criminal athletes that play and the things that go on off the field. And even the behavior of some of the owners, which is even downright criminal when you look at like Haslam on the Browns and the owner for the Vikings, whose name eludes me right now. I think there are people who are turned off by that, and I think that is affecting their bottom line. How much, it's hard to say, but I think it's definitely a factor.
And speaking of bottom lines, the meat of the matter, what we're discussing here today is Christie versus NCAA. It's an upcoming Supreme Court case. I believe the first oral arguments will be in December. Basically, it revolves around something called PASPA, and basically a court case that was challenged in New Jersey, which could overturn this federal legislation. So for those of us who aren't really on the up and up about this particular Supreme Court case, can you give us a brief overview of what Christie versus NCAA is all about?
Well, what it really boils down to is this PASPA law, which was passed in 1992, and it's the Professional and Amateur Sports Protection Act. And what it really does is it doesn't really protect professional or amateur sports at all. What it does is it basically makes it illegal for states who want to legalize sports gambling. They're not allowed to do so. Now, back in 1992, there was a grandfather clause for like the state of Nevada, which has sports gambling in all its forms, and it was legalized at the time. That allowed that to continue. It allowed states, I think it was Oregon, Montana, and Delaware, to continue their sports lotteries, which they had offered back then, to continue if they wanted to do so. And it also gave a one-year window for states like New Jersey, who had established casino gambling, to legalize sports gambling if they wanted to. Now, the state of New Jersey, for whatever reason, didn't take advantage of that opening when they had it. And now here it is, 25 years later, they determined, well, we do want to add this. And because PASPA won't let us do it, we're going to take it to the Supreme Court and basically force them to allow this to happen, to allow legalized sports gambling.
And while this particular case is, superficially just about sports gambling, it actually could have pretty big ramifications even outside of that domain, because it's basically a law about the extent of federal legislators' ability to control state laws. So what do you think could be some of the big consequences of this? Is it limited just to sports gambling, or do you see it maybe seeping into other aspects of American life?
Well, I'm sure it can seep into other things, but I don't know of really any other laws, at least myself, and I'm not a legal expert, but I don't know of any other laws that really are out there that says, this state can do this legally, but these other states can't. I mean, the closest thing is perhaps some of these marijuana laws that are on the books that allow certain states to legalize it, and other states they have to keep it illegal, be it medical marijuana or just, general usage of marijuana. But I think also what potentially could happen is if PASPA does get overturned, which a lot of people think that's likely, I think it's really still a 50-50 question. But if it does get overturned, I think it's really going to alter the sports landscape. And I think it's going to alter it in ways that may not be 100% really beneficial for the average ordinary fan.
And when we're looking at this particular SCOTUS challenge coming up, Christie versus NCAA, it's also being fused with another court case that escapes me for the moment, but it's also from New Jersey. So basically, what is the argument of the plaintiffs and the defendants on why this law is unconstitutional and why they believe it is constitutional?
Well, for the state of New Jersey and the other states that may follow suit trying to legalize sports gambling, their argument is the fact that there can't be a federal law that basically supersedes the state laws in terms of passing something that the Constitution says has no really say about. I mean, there's no specific thing in the Constitution that says you can't have legalized sports gambling. And so they can't really pass this law that lords over the states that tells them this is what you have to do, this is how you can operate, this is how you can't operate, especially when they passed this law and again gave the state of Nevada kind of a monopoly on legalized sports betting. And Nevada really wants to retain that because it does a lot of good for the state and it causes a lot of attention to the state, especially the city of Las Vegas and the legal casinos and sports books that operate there. But, you know, like I said, the problem is the law was passed and even created by the professional sports leagues and the NCAA. And the reason I think it's called the Protection, Sports Amateur and Sports Protection Act, is the fact is they argued that they needed this passed because they didn't want sports gambling to spread because they were afraid that the more it spread, the more corruption would be involved in sports gambling itself, as well as that kind of corruption that would affect the integrity of their games and their leagues. And that's something I don't buy. I think it's something that they kind of trumped up into being because, in my opinion, the fact that the vast majority of sports gambling, I mean, we're talking like 95% of the sports gambling done in the United States is done illegally, that has no oversight, that has no, anybody monitoring what's going on, that actually probably is more likely to be affecting the integrity of the games than if everything was above the board and watched and monitored by, some sort of state or federal agency.
And on the campaign trail last year, Donald Trump himself said he was in favor of overturning PASPA. Just looking at the Supreme Court constituents that we have now, what do you feel is the likelihood of PASPA being overturned in this case?
Like I said before, I think it's really kind of a 50-50 thing. I think part of the problem for the state is the fact that everywhere they've challenged it, it's always been upheld. There's never been a ruling that's been by a lower court that said, yeah, we can overturn PASPA, and then that's been, appealed to a higher circuit court, and they said, no, you can't do that. Every time it's come up, every time it's faced a legal challenge, it's always lost. The state of New Jersey's always lost this argument. So it's even surprised, I think, some people that the Supreme Court decided to hear this case because, again, there hasn't been really a conflict anywhere within the court system, the judicial system, that said that this is a bad law or this is an improperly worded law or that there's some problem with it. So I think they do have an uphill battle there. But I think more in the general term, which may not really affect the Supreme Court, but more in a general term, it is a law that is probably not a good law. It's probably one that should be overturned. Now, whether the Supreme Court will rule that way just because they think it's not a good law is something completely different. But I think the better way to resolve all this is to re-lobby Congress and get them to write a law that either repeals PASPA or alters it in a way that will allow states to legalize sports gambling if they so choose.
And if PASPA is overturned by the Supreme Court, how long would it take for it to be fully dismantled or repealed?
That's a good question. I don't know how quick it would go into effect. But basically, I think as soon as it was overturned, as soon as it was legally available for a state like New Jersey to legalize sports gambling, they will be in and on it and ready to go as quick as possible. And there's other states. I think like the state of California is really ready to do it. I think the state of Louisiana is another one that's really ready to do it. So I think there's states lining up and getting their ducks in a row. So if this does come to pass, you will see sports gambling spread very quickly within the United States.
And I know you got to play with hypotheticals here, but what do you see being the immediate and long-term impacts of PASPA hypothetically becoming legalized?
Well, I think the immediate effects are almost the same as the long-term effects, really, in many ways, is because I think what's going to happen is on multiple different fronts. I think from the average sports fan watching sports, the coverage of the games, and this is every league, the NFL, the NBA may be the main ones, but I think every league is going to be affected broadcast-wise, because I think what the broadcast partners, the NBCs, the ESPNs, the Fox, I think they're going to think, okay, now that this is legalized, especially if it gets legalized in a vast majority of the states, or at least the most populated states, they're going to think what we need to do now is cover these games from a gambling perspective and do it all the time. The point spread's going to be something that's openly talked about all the time. Injuries that occur are going to be talked about in relation to this point spread. And I really think it's going to change and alter the coverage of the sports media. And I don't think it's going to really change and alter it in a good way. For, like I say, for most casual fans, I think a lot of fans do bet on the games. I think that's why a lot of fans follow, games that are supposedly meaningless and uninteresting. It's because they do have some sort of monetary stake, be it on an outright bet or in fantasy sports. But I think that there's a lot of fans, like my wife, for example, who would never bet on the game, who will not really enjoy the coverage turning in such a way into making every living room and basement, in America into a miniature sports book. I think that's going to be a really negative thing. And I think if sports gambling gets legalized on a big way, that's what's going to happen, because you will probably be able to bet from your computer or from your phone, and will make it ubiquitous throughout the sports landscape.
Yeah, we already have things like FanDuel in place. Do you see perhaps some of these fantasy sports modules actually transition to full-time betting as a result?
I wouldn't be surprised. If they were smart and they're able to do it, I think it would be a wise move for them in the long term, because I think it would potentially make them more money. The only problem is I think for those companies is that there are bigger, more established sports books out there, like William Hill, which is based in the United Kingdom, that are, again, chomping at the bit to get into the United States, because they know how big sports gambling is as an industry here. And again, the scary part is with sports gambling, the illegal market that exists right now is nobody really knows how big it is. Estimates range from $100 billion a year to like $500 billion a year being wagered illegally on sports in the United States. And that's a huge amount of money. That's potentially $500 billion a year being wagered on, and there's no oversight and there's no regulation. But if that becomes legalized, then that's, a huge amount of money for a lot of companies to try to go after and get their claim of.
And really, one of the long-term barriers to PASPA being overturned has been the pro sports leagues themselves. NFL, NBA, NCAA, NHL all have been vehemently adamant about not having this particular legislation overturned. So in general, what is their opposition to PASPA and really legalized sports betting in general?
Well, I don't think they're naive enough to think that, their fans aren't already betting as it is. I think even the NBA commissioner, Adam Silver, has basically said he wouldn't be, opposed to PASPA being overturned and legalized sports gambling becoming a thing, because he realizes that it probably would help the league in terms of viewers and in terms of interest. But their long-time standing argument as to why they're opposed to it is twofold. One is they're afraid of turning fans becoming just gamblers, and fans not necessarily rooting for the home team anymore, but really rooting for the home team to cover the point spread or beat the under-over, which is a completely different thing. And they're also been afraid of basically how this gambling could affect the integrity of their games, because a lot of people have the notion that because there is gambling on sports, there's game fixing going on, that there's matches being thrown, there's points, being shaved in different sports. And I think that is a reality. And what I think the real concern is if it does become legalized, because there will be extra oversight, because there will be extra regulation, because the sports books will be national and they'll be watching all the bets being made, that there will be some sort of underhanded thing going on that we've seen in tennis and cricket and soccer, rugby and sports all around the world, but supposedly not here in the United States, that if there is this legalization and there is all this oversight will actually find something going on underhandedly. It will lead to investigation, and then it will lead to a major scandal. And the leagues right now can say, hey, look, we're fighting to keep this illegal because, we're doing it for basically the greater good. But I think it's more of a cover your own butt type of situation where they're like, if anything should happen once it's legalized, they can say, hey, we didn't want the sports gambling. We did our best to keep it out, but now it's happened. This is what occurred. We tried, but we failed. But, don't pin this on us. Pin this on the people who made sports gambling legal.
Yeah, and how would legalized sports gambling impact the bottom line of the NFL and NBA?
Well, I think it would actually help them. I mean, I think more people would be apt to wager on the games and therefore then watch the games because they wagered on them. And if you could do it, from the comfort of your home, if you could do it from your phone, then I think people are going to be more apt to do it. So I think it would help the leagues. But again, it's more of a perception thing. It's more of a PR thing as to why I think they're fighting against it than really a reason for, concern. Like I say, I think it's a PR show as opposed to a thing where they're really afraid of, people becoming gamblers. I think they know gamblers are fans who watch.
And of course, it's a perfect segue to something I like to call the last Boy Scout argument against sports gambling legalization. When we talk about the influence of the Mafia and organized crime, about how much of an influence do they have on illegal sports gambling in the U.S.? Is like an estimate for how much money they generate through that?
From I've learned from talking to former FBI agents is that sports gambling is either number one or number two biggest moneymaker for organized crime today. And again, if it's $100 billion a year being wagered illegally, or if it's $500 billion a year, because these estimates vary wildly and nobody really knows the answer, but whatever it is, the mob is getting a big chunk of that money right now. And that money is going to other endeavors of organized crime. And that's the thing is, people who are sitting at home and betting $50 or $100 with their local bookie think it's no big deal, think it's a victimless crime, but they don't understand is that money that they bet with their bookie is usually connected to organized crime, whether they know it or not, because their bookie often lays off bets with other bookies who lay off with other bookies. And sooner or later, that $50, $100 winds up in organized crime's hands. And then they use that money for prostitution. They use it for loan sharking. They use it for all these other types of endeavors that they're involved in. But their big money maker is sports gambling.
Yeah, so it seems to me that the Mafia would have a really big opposition to PASPA being overturned. So, are there any rumblings on the ground about maybe them trying to kind of get a foot in the game and try to keep the law from being passed?
Well, it's very possible. I mean, some people thought, that's actually why the state of New Jersey did not pursue, legalizing sports gambling back in 1992, 93 when they had the opportunities, because organized crime kind of got in the way from that happening. A big moneymaker for them. If it does become legal, they can attempt to put on a corporate face. They can attempt to themselves kind of legalize and try to make money off of this. And it'll be interesting to see because even though there are big legal, corporate bookmakers, like in Las Vegas right now, there's really about 3 or 4 corporate sports books that run all the casinos there. Even though there may be different casinos that have different sports books that are actually owned and operated by the same sports book company, like I mentioned before, William Hill or Cantor One. It's going to be hard for them to battle against these guys because they've been doing it longer. They have everything set up already to do it. All they need is basically the green light, and these corporations will jump right in and start offering, betting as soon as they can.
And this whole sports betting legalization dilemma thing here, it really reminds me a lot of the parallels between the legalization of marijuana. Because you're seeing a lot of dispensaries pop up, and there's some questions about the federal interaction with conflicting with state laws. So, if sports betting is legalized nationally, what do you think the industry of legalized wagering might resemble? Would it be sort of similar to what we're seeing in Colorado and Washington with the legalized marijuana dispensaries?
Well, I think it depends how fast it blossoms. If just 1 or 2 states legalize it and it takes a while for another state to jump in, then it may be kind of like that with the marijuana in Colorado. But I think, like I said before, I think these major corporate bookmaking operations that really exist overseas will jump in and take control. So I don't think there'll be a lot of mom and pop operations. I think it's going to be 1 or 2 companies that kind of run this really from state to state, from sea to sea. I think they'll control the vast majority of it because, again, they have all the abilities already out there. They run legalized sports gambling in, the United Kingdom and other places, and they would just take over here as much as possible. But I do think at the same time, Now, because they are so corporate and because they do actually block bettors, I should say. If a guy's too successful, they'll actually limit how much they can wager and that sort of thing. I think there is an opportunity for smaller, more independent operators to exist and to actually do well within the system, but they got to be willing to put up more risk at the beginning to get established before people really begin to trust them, because that's one of the things like the William Hills and the Cantor Gamings have for them is longevity, is trust, and is a name in the industry.
And considering if PASPA is overturned, you see it being sort of like an overnight cottage industry, somewhat similar to something like Uber, where just completely over the course of a couple of, not even a year, you have an entire multi-billion-dollar industry of these upstarts, people, literally running books out of their basement. Do you see that happening, or is it just too much corporate oversight?
Well, I think, like I say, I think there is a possibility for it. I mean, and I think for a lot of people who are naive to how sports gambling is and how it operates, I think to them it will appear that way. Even if it is like William Hill, like I say, which is one of the biggest bookmakers in the world, if they step in and take the vast majority of control, once they start airing television ads, a lot of people who watch sports regular might be, well, who's William Hill? I've never heard of these guys before. It might be like when FanDuel and DraftKings really started advertising like crazy during the NFL season about 2 years ago, when people at first didn't know who these companies were. They didn't know what they did. And then within 6 weeks, they were sick of seeing their advertisements because they were everywhere. I think the same thing might happen with the legalized sports gambling, is that these big companies will start pushing out, advertising and promotions and be everywhere and anywhere, because, the first couple ones in that really get a foothold are probably the ones that are going to take off and do the best.
And would you see regulation working on a state-by-state basis, or would there be something sort of similar to a EPA for gambling under the federal legislation?
I highly doubt it'll be federalized. I don't think that's the job for the federal government, for one, that they should do. But because it won't be legalized in all 50 states, I think it will be on a state-to-state basis. I think a lot of things, it'll be related to almost horse racing and the pari-mutuel wagering system that exists and has existed for a long time within that sport, where it is just a state by state that runs it, but there is kind of a national scene, this pari-mutuel wagering, where you can be in, Illinois and bet on races in Florida and in California and that sort of thing. The only problem, which a lot of people I don't think quite get, is, horse racing has existed for a long time. It's been legal to bet on horse races for a very long time. And it has the regulation, it has the oversight, it has all the good things that people say will happen when they legalize sports gambling. And yet there's a vast majority of races that are corrupt. There's a lot of problems within horse racing. There's a lot of illegalities that go on, a lot of corruption that never gets ferreted out, or if it does, very few people hear about it. So it's not like all this regulation and oversight that might come to professional sports gambling will make it really a clean endeavor, because horse racing is very corrupt. And even though it has all this oversight, it's not being stopped because there's so much money pumping through it. People are finding various ways of getting that money when they shouldn't. And a lot of it comes through fixing horse races, drugging horses, shocking horses, all sorts of horrible things that go on in horse racing that few people hear about. It's very well likely that the same sort of corruption is going on right now in NCAA games and in professional sports leagues. And even if it does get legalized and there is oversight, it doesn't mean that's going to necessarily stop. It just might actually get a little more attention.
And one of the interesting things that I think not a lot of people would think about when we're talking about legalized sports gambling coast to coast, what sort of, government protected safeguards would you have? I mean, would you have something like an FDIC to sort of guarantee that, if the money goes into the gambling trust, that there'll actually be payouts?
Well, I think, like I say, there is something like that exists with the pari-mutuel wagering system in horse racing already. So I think that's one thing that they can look to work off of. And I think, with casino gambling and the sports books in Las Vegas, there's really, as far as I know, really never been an issue in terms of, payouts being made and that sort of thing. I think, again, these companies are, at least with those big time companies, the big corporate ones, there hasn't been an issue. The problem might be, if we see mom and pop type operations jump up, that there may be some that pop up and instantly go bankrupt. It's hard to say. but I don't know if there will be some sort of insurance. There was back in the day, back in the 1950s, when sports gambling was a little more loose in the United States. You could actually get like a license. You could get licensed. I think it was from the state, might have been from federal government, but I'm pretty sure it was from the state, your local state, and be licensed as a bookmaker. The problem was back then the taxes were so incredibly high, it really wasn't worth the time and effort to get the license and then have to pay the taxes over and above, what you made as a bookmaker. But such a system did exist at one time here in the United States.
Let's talk about some of the potential economic impacts of legalized sports gambling. Just as a rough estimate, if sports gambling was legalized coast to coast, is there an estimate for how much more money it would generate compared to illegal gambling that we have going on now?
I don't think so because, again, I don't think anybody knows how much illegal gambling really goes on. And that, to me, that's really frightening because nobody seems to have a handle on it. It's all just guesstimates. I mean, Las Vegas says they're 2 to 3% of all the sports gambling that goes on in the United States. Well, they do about, I think it's around $3 billion a year in wagers that they take in. And so, I mean, if it's, 3%, $3 billion, it means it's a $100 billion a year industry elsewhere. But it could be more, it could be less. Nobody really knows. But like I said, I think if it is legalized, and it is legalized in many states, we'll see a true number emerge. And I think we'll see people who aren't necessarily were gambling before or were kind of afraid of gambling before because of having to deal with a bookmaker and it seemed kind of shady. I think these people will go out and bet legally if they're given that opportunity.
And what would be some of the residual impact on sports leagues and casinos if legalized gambling becomes reality?
Well, it depends how they do it and how much is allowed. I mean, I think, obviously every casino that's out there in a state where it's legalized would instantly open a sports book and would instantly offer it as soon as they could. The question is, would you allow it, like you say, on the computer, would you allow betting by phone? They do actually on horse racing today. You can bet online on horse races if it's legal in your state. So the question is, will they allow internet gambling on sports or not? Hard to say. But I think the sports leagues, like I said, I think the impact won't necessarily be on the leagues itself, but I think it'd be more on the coverage of the leagues and how, like I say, it might even take a somewhat ugly turn in the fact where everything suddenly isn't necessarily about the game or who's winning the division or who might win the championship. It's going to be more about what's the point spread on the game, what are the odds on this team winning the championship, and then, how much money is being wagered on this team or that team and that outcome. And what does this outcome mean to the sports books, and what does that outcome mean to the sports books? And like I say, I think it's something that the leagues, I think, rightfully worried about, and one of the things that they tried to make PASPA happen because of. But I think it's a legitimate concern because I think things will change. And like I say, I don't think they'll necessarily change for the betterment.
And, pending that PASPA is overturned, do you perhaps see any sort of irregularities or discrepancies in how betting on professional sports compared to amateur sports would be arranged?
Well, that's another good question, too, because, the NCAA has kind of argued almost separately from the professional sports leagues because of the fact that their players are amateurs. And they've, I think, made a good argument, in my opinion. Now, some people disagree, but in my opinion, they've made the argument that, look, we're an amateur sport, even though college football and college basketball are multi-million-dollar industries of their own, but they're an amateur sport, and they didn't feel that people should be wagering on that because it might affect things. But the problem is the genie's out of the bottle. You can't return it. And even if they did make, sports gambling legalized in the United States, but they said, okay, you can't bet on NCAA games, well, then that's not going to kill bookies because bookies who operated illegally now are going to continue to operate illegally and just be betting and booking on college, football and college basketball games because it's not going to stop people from doing it. So, I mean, while I think they do put out a good argument, I think the NCAA is going to have to really almost accept what occurs with professional sports and go right along with them because they have very little alternative.
And there are two really sort of interesting areas of the sports world I think would be kind of sort of a gray area when it comes to PASPA if it were overturned. Number one, what would be the impact on high school sports? Do you think that's something where maybe that's a little bit too far that people wouldn't go for that? And how would it impact non-team sports? How would it impact something like boxing or mixed martial arts?
Well, I think with the high school sports, hopefully that's where people would draw the line. And I say that hopefully because I've actually seen a couple of FBI files. Now, granted, they were older files from like either the 60s or 70s, but they actually discussed potentially people betting on high school sports and then tampering with those outcomes, believe it or not. So you kind of question, you kind of wonder, would it go down to that level where people are betting on Texas high school football games or, Florida high school football games because they're such a big attraction and there's such a big deal down in those. I would hope it wouldn't get to that level. I hope we can keep that out of the, out of the discussion. But with the individual sports, like you say, like with tennis and boxing, the nice thing again was I think it would be allowed to people bet on them and gamble on them. The problem is they're also the easiest things to corrupt, and they're also the easiest sports to fix. I mean, boxing has a corrupt history that goes back well over 100 years, and tennis continually, even today, because it's the second most bet upon sport in the world, believe it or not, behind soccer. Tennis actually has a corruption problem. They have a tennis integrity unit that every year ferrets out plenty of matches that have been fixed. And it's been fixed because of gambling, and because the problem with gambling, like on tennis, and something that could potentially come to the United States but really hasn't yet, is like with tennis and soccer and some of the other sports in Britain and elsewhere, is you can bet on in-game events. You don't necessarily bet on who wins or loses. You can actually bet on, in tennis, you can bet on individual games, individual sets. You can even bet on individual serves. And because of this, they found that the athletes who may not be willing to fix an entire match would be willing to potentially throw like the second game of the second set because it can net them a profit. Or they may be willing to, do certain serves out as on purpose because people are betting on them. I mean, so they've been found the spot fixing exists, and they don't even know really what to level it exists. But yet, it's not stopping the bookmakers or the gambling industry from offering this sort of betting, which is causing this sort of spot fixing. So, it's a problem that's everywhere. And I think even if they legalize it in the United States, you're not going to be able to regulate it all. You're not going to be able to watch it all, despite the best intentions and the PR that's going to be put out in regards to it all.
And so far we've had a pretty rosy outlook on the net positives of legalized sports gambling coast to coast, but what would be some of the downsides? I mean, are there any industries or particular people who would be specifically hurt economically by this?
Well, I think the biggest issue would be the amount of people who have gambling addiction problems. And when I researched my book, Season in the Abyss, I actually talked to people in the United Kingdom and asked them about that because they've done studies related to it. And they found basically the more legalized gambling spread within that country, the more little bookmaking shops operated in certain neighborhoods and such. When they opened, they would instantly see a spike in people with problem gambling, people with addiction problems. And so I think, the same could easily be said here. And that's something that gets totally blown over in the United States is gambling addiction. And I think, if you do open up legalized sports gambling, first of all, sports gambling appeals to more younger people, especially young men, college-age men who not necessarily can afford betting, but think because I know sports so well, I can profit doing this, and then find that, picking a winner and picking a winner against a point spread is two completely different things, that you are going to have a lot more kids, younger adults who have problems, who have financial problems because of the spread, are going to have addiction problems because of the spread of sports gambling. And it's going to be something that basically is just always going to be a disclaimer. Like if you have a gambling problem, call this number. But that's the only thing said in a 2-minute ad that hypes how great sports gambling is and how luxurious it is and how exotic it is and that sort of thing and how you can make money doing it. But nobody's going to really pay attention to the fine print of this could lead to problems for a lot of people.
And to wrap up, what would you consider to be the absolute best argument for why sports betting should be legalized everywhere in the U.S.?
I feel it should be legalized basically for the oversight that comes with it. Because in Europe and even in Las Vegas, where it is legalized, there are all these things put in place to have some oversight on it all. Whereas right now, again, in the United States, the vast majority of it is done illegally There's no oversight. There's no regulation. Nobody knows what's really going on, who's being affected, if anybody's being paid off, if games are being fixed. None of that can be found because nobody can trace any of the money and where it goes. And if it's legalized, then most of it will be brought out into the light. And as they always say, follow the money. You can follow what happens. You can see where people are betting. You can see abnormalities. And as they do in Europe, then they can flag them. They can further investigate them. And then that's led to, outright games being fixed. And they've been able to find and arrest the people who have fixed those matches. And so if it is legalized in the United States, at least you'll have some sort of oversight and some ability to track the corruption that's going to go along with this industry.
And, with that in mind, hopefully there'll be a downturn in the sales of concrete shoes as well.
Exactly. Well, that's another thing, too, is it will take the power out of organized crime's control. It might put it in another corporate crime, syndicate, but at least it's looked upon with a little, better light than the Mafia is. But that's true. I mean, it really will. It will take it out of organized crime control, and it will affect the bottom line of the Mafia.
All right. Well, once again, I want to thank you so much for taking time to your schedule to talk to us today, Brian. And we'll just let you take this time here in our concluding moments to plug your website and any social media sites you'd like.
Well, if people are interested in learning more about what I write about, finding my books, or just contacting me with questions or what have you, the best place to go is my website, which is thefixisin.net. And you can find all my social media there. And like I say, you can find my books there. And like I say, if people want to shoot me an email, feel free to do so. I always answer them. So,
and I've heard through the grapevine that you have a new book you're working on. So can you tell us a little about that?
Yeah, the new book is kind of my best evidence to show people how much corruption already exists in professional and college sports, because it's a subject, again, that I don't feel gets enough attention. And I want fans, if they want to watch games, if they want to have the escapism of watching sports, that's fine, but I want them to be informed, and I want them to understand what they're really watching and what it really means, because this is, again, multi-billion-dollar industry, and in many ways it's predatory. It acts as a drug for fans, and it takes advantage of fans because they know in a way they are addicted to these sports. So I just want fans to be more educated and realize that there is a lot of corruption in and around these games, and to be leery of it, and to know, again, what you're getting into when you give them your time and your money and your energy.
And with all the stuff going on in the NCAA with Rick Pitino and pals, that's a very timely subject.
Well, unfortunately, it's always a timely subject. The problem is that all these things that happen always get written off as isolated incidents. But the fact of the matter is there's so many of them, they're not isolated incidents. They may not necessarily be connected to each other, but, you heap enough of these on top of each other, and suddenly you have a big mountain of isolated incidents, and that's a problem.
All right, and I'll let you, our final moments here, have the final word. Feel free to, if there's anything we haven't talked about today that you want to drive home, or any, prevailing point about the sports media complex or politics in general, go ahead and shoot away.
Well, you bring up the sports media. They're my biggest problem, and they're my concern, because I could tell you stories, but, there are incidents that have happened to me where I've been basically what I call censored by omission. And the fact is, like ESPN, I've been on over 150 different radio shows, but ESPN won't have me on any of theirs. I've been in Sports Illustrated, yet, ESPN wouldn't pick up certain stories that I've been connected to. And I just find it really interesting that if they can silence me, I'm not making stuff up, even though I'm considered a conspiracy theorist, all my stuff is based on facts and evidence, and a lot of the stories are 100% non-deniably true, and yet they still won't pick me up. So I find it interesting that, if this can happen in sports, which doesn't mean that much, what's going on with other writers who are covering more important topics? What else is being shut out because the big corporate media outlets can shut them out and not give those people a proper voice?
And people do forget ESPN, owned by Disney, one of the biggest conglomerates in the world. So who knows what shady stuff's going on there?
Well, exactly. That's the scary part. And remember, that company, too, is funding the NFL. ESPN is funding the National Basketball Association. They fund Major League Baseball. And that's what a lot of people don't get, is that these networks give these leagues money. They literally fund them, and these leagues wouldn't be the same funding. So they're really a symbiote. They work together. They're not adversarial at all. And that's another thing that a lot of sports fans I don't think fully comprehend.
Once again, we here at Not Economically Viable would like to thank Brian Tuohy for speaking with us today. If you'd like to read more of Tuohy's musings, you can find him online on Twitter at TheFixIsInTuohy and on Facebook at facebook.com/TheFixIsInTuohy. All of his books are available on Amazon, as well as his official website, thefixisin.net. As always, we'd like to remind our listeners and viewers that each and every episode of Not Economically Viable is published under a Creative Commons license, so everyone is free to re-edit, recycle, and redistribute the clips however they please. Information wants to be free, and I'm more than happy to do my part.